wearing that's in your home has a life cycle. It's manufactured somewhere, which is a reflection of technology. It's a reflection of a culture of production. They then are traded and moved from place to place at different times, showing the types of economic networks that would be present in a particular time. One of the things I often have my students do is inventory the clothes in their closet, and they're shocked to find where everything comes from to get to them. We're all still part of those networks. Artifacts are then purchased, and I put purchase in quotes because of course we know there are many ways we can barter and trade and gift and those things. But that people make choices about what it is they want to own. So of all the artifacts available, people pick certain ones because of, maybe it's because of cost, maybe it's because of an aesthetic, something they think is attractive, maybe it's because of a status symbol, lots of different reasons. But people are making choices about what it is they personally want to own out of all of the things that are available to them. Artifacts then gain meaning through how they're used. And people don't always use artifacts the way that they're intended. We often take things out of packages in our home and end up using them for something radically different. My entire house, I swear, was held together by duct tape and dental floss. My father is very far away, I can say that. Everything was jerry-rigged and fixed, and none of the materials he used were the way that the package told you to use them. The house was fine, but it was always a little, we use things in very different ways. And then the end of any artifact's lifestyle is that it's discarded, it's thrown away. And so all of these different stages can tell us something very different about the groups of people who were involved in a particular artifact, whatever that thing is. So we have the idea of patterns, landscapes, and artifacts that are factoring into an archaeological analysis. So this approach works really well for cemeteries. So let's bring it into sort of where we're going to go with this tonight. The first thing that makes cemeteries really wonderful to study is that they're fixed in space. They don't move. Lots of types of artifacts move, but cemeteries are pretty stable on the landscape, so they're very useful for archaeological study. A cemetery in Nassau is going to tell you about Nassau. You don't have to wonder if it got there some other way. They also are really good about time because one of the key features of a cemetery, right, is that we put the date stamp on things. So by stamping things with dates, we know when different events in a cemetery happen, the events that are being commemorated. So for an archaeological analysis looking at patterns, cemeteries are actually really ideal. Cemeteries also have a spatial component. They're laid out on the landscape. There are different pathways, there are different sections. They are segregated from the community generally in different types of ways. And they also have those artifacts, headstones, right, are a perfect artifact that fit all of those criteria for analysis to analyze. So they have both of those things. They also, it's well documented, recognized social organization in the past. They also reflect how each individual or individual family is choosing to participate in the social networks of their time. And they also tell us some important things about the symbolic, cognitive types of things that are going on with people. And I just want to show you, this is a cemetery in South Carolina, and I love to show this example because if any of you have ever been, and I'm sure you probably have, been to St. Matthew's here in Nassau, this always strikes me as you could almost imagine, just substitute the church and the thing, how similar it is. Of course, we know many of the loyalists came from the Carolinas, and it's always very interesting to sort of have a little bit of a look. This is an 18th century graveyard from South Carolina, and I think it has a wonderful resonance for sort of images here in the Bahamas. So I put that up there. So this is sort of how these ideas get translated into cemeteries. And so before we get, so this is your second big introduction, it's kind of an interesting thing, is that what are the historical influences on Bohemian cemeteries? So when I became interested in the cemeteries on San Salvador and certainly in enjoying seeing the cemeteries here in Nassau and on the other family islands that I visited, where do we learn about, or where do influences on Bohemian cemeteries come from? And there are sort of two main lines of that. So, of course, most of the cemeteries that we see here in the Bahamas are directly related to Christian traditions, and most people don't really think about where those traditions come from. I know I never did. But it's actually fairly interesting, is that the tradition of burying people actually begins largely in medieval times, the importance of marked graves in central spaces. And the majority of Christian traditions at the time emphasized returning the body to God, the ashes to ashes, dust to dust type of thing. And so burial became the preferred way of interring people and the preferred form of mortuary treatment because you could return the body to God, as the Bible says to do. Being buried inside of a church, thereby closest to God, was the preferred way to be interred. And so the earliest recorded graves across Europe are found in these contexts. And if any of you have ever been, to England or other places, certainly Westminster Abbey is a perfect example of that. Everything is covered with different, now cenotaphs, but the remains of this type of a practice where people were being interred inside of churches. This causes a problem, however, in most of these communities because churches are only so big. People keep passing away, and it made church ceremonies increasingly unpleasant, and the areas inside the church where you could inter people increasingly crowded. It's basic function. And so what happened, the reason that we start to see these outdoor cemeteries and graveyards is because they decide that the next best thing is to be buried next to the church. You're still being buried close to God, you're returning the body to God, and so the church graveyard is born. These are pictures from England and from Ireland, just because that's where I happened to be traveling when I was thinking about these things, and so there they are. But these are very typical graveyards. So there they are, sort of right outside the church. Graveyards at the time are the preferred sort of mortuary treatment when people are coming to the United States for the very first time, before it is the United States. It's a British colony. And these are examples. The bottom one is, again, that wonderful cemetery in South Carolina. The northern, the top slide is a northern example. That's in Boston. That's the Granary Burying Ground, where many of our famous revolutionary figures are buried, as well as Mother Goose is buried in the Granary Cemetery. She has lots of children, so those stories came from somewhere. They have lots of little goose headstones, so there she is. So with the exception of sort of rural family plots where people were being buried on their own lands, this is the typical way that people were being interred. So this is the type of idea about a cemetery or how a graveyard should look at the time the Loyalists leave the United States and come to the Bahamas and elsewhere. This is the pattern that they're used to. This is what a graveyard would have looked like, and these are the kinds of things that would have as a way to space this. And I think that you can all probably imagine it's not hard to see this type of influence here in Nassau and elsewhere in the Bahamas. But something happens in America in the mid-1850s and in England, and that is that they decide that it's not a good idea to have very crowded church graveyards in the centers of towns. And so what's born is what's called the Rural Garden Cemetery movement. And these are spaces that are taken, they're large, large cemeteries, and this is the difference. If somebody ever asks you, a graveyard or these church graveyards, cemeteries are these spaces on the outskirts that were originally built on the outskirts of cities, both in England and the United States. They were planned spaces, and they were where people had to be interred by law after the mid-19th century. So this is something that then, of course, people here would have been aware of as well because of the connections to both the United States and England. So it would have had some sort of a cultural influence. And what happens, rather than sort of the way that graveyards almost grew up organically, you just kept using the place around the church, these are planned spaces. And this is a map of perhaps the most famous rural garden cemetery in the United States. This is Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's just on the other side of the river from Boston. And they're very